Firewalls are a common cause of port connectivity problems. Let's look at what a firewall does. A firewall determines what connections are allowed in to the operating system and which ones are not. So for example, this firewall is allowing port 80 or HTTP traffic into the operating system. The firewall will have a set of rules that says what traffic's allowed in and what traffic's not. Whereas if other traffic where there's no rule that defines the traffic's allowed in comes to the firewall will not allow it through into the operating system. So for example, in this case, port 25 or SMTP traffic, there's no rule, it will not allow it through the firewall. I'm going to open Windows Firewall with Advanced Security. So this is the firewall that's available in Vista or above. So that's Vista, Windows 7, Windows 2008, and Windows 2008 R2. And I'm going to show how to create some rules and how to manage this firewall. So the first thing we see is the status of the firewall. I'm going to come here to Windows Firewall Properties. And we can see that we have domain, private, and public profile. Depending on the state of Windows, rules for these various profiles will be used. I generally recommend you set them to the same unless there's a specific reason why you would want, for example, when you're connected to your domain and your enterprise network, to have different rules than when you're at home. Generally, for a developer, you're going to want the same rules across the board though. We see we can set the firewall state. By default, it's on. And by default, we block inbound connections, so traffic coming into our machine, and we allow any traffic going out, so any traffic that originates from our machine. Another thing we can look at, and this can be useful, is to turn on logging. So by default, no dropped or successful connections are logged. If we think we might have an issue with the firewall dropping a packet, it could be useful to come in here to log drop packets and change that to yes. And then wherever you specify, by default it's this pfirewall.log inside the Windows folder, it will log those connections so you're able to see if the Windows firewall is dropping packets that are inbound to your machine. Now let's look at rules. I'm going to come to my inbound rules here, and you'll see there's already a bunch defined. This is just out of the box, the default list of rules that are available. We're going to add some additional rules. So we're going to right-click Inbound Rules and say New Rule. You can see in this wizard we have 4 options. Create a rule by program, port, a predefined set of rules, or custom. Let's start with program. A program rule says that a specific executable, whatever ports it's trying to listen on, we can allow those ports in. So for example, I'm going to use my listen on port executable that we used in the previous clip. And then it's going to ask, do I want to allow the connection if it's secure, or block the connection. Generally, you're going to allow the connection because you're blocking all traffic by default. The allow the connection if secure, that entails having what's called an IPsec connection between 2 computers. It's not commonly used by developers, so we're just going to ignore it. We're either going to go with allow the connection or block the connection. And since we almost always are going to block traffic by default, all we're going to do is create rules to allow specific traffic in. So we can almost always leave this at allow the connection. And then it asks which profiles do we want this rule to apply to. We're going to use the same rules in every profile, domain, private, and public. So we're just going to leave all 3 boxes checked. And then we give it a name. So in this case, we're going to call it TCP listener process. Click Finish. I'm going to close my PowerPoint. And we're going to see we have up here the TCP listener process. Now when this process starts, whatever ports it opens to listen on, the firewall will allow that traffic through. This can be really handy for applications that use multiple ports, and it's sometimes difficult to know which ones need to be used. This allows you to just say this process, this specific executable, allow whatever traffic it needs, and it simplifies the firewall rules for you. Let's create some more rules. Now we're going to create one by port. So in this case, let's come in, we're going to do a TCP port, and we're going to specify, we can choose between TCP and UDP. We're going to choose TCP. We can say all ports, which we probably don't want to do. And we can say specify the local ports. So I'm going to say port 80, 443. So this will allow HTTP or HTTPS traffic. Say next. Again, we're going to allow the connection, domain private public, give it a name. So this is the HTTP/HTTPS rule. Say finish. And now we have a rule that allows HTTP and HTTPS traffic in. So this would be a rule you'd want to set on your web server. Let's do another type of rule. Let's do a predefined rule. So here we have a bunch of predefined rules. This list is populated by the services that have been installed on the Windows services that have been installed on this particular machine. I'm going to come down here to remote desktop. So that's being able to RDP or remotely connect to a computer. I'm going to use the predefined remote desktop rule. We'll see that it's the inbound rule, kind of specifies a rule set for us. It's going to allow TCP 3389. That's the port used by remote desktop protocol. So it just gives us a predefined set of rules. Let me go back and find a more complicated one. Let's use routing volume management. It's going to have several rules that it needs. So this just allows for the more complicated services that Windows provides to kind of have a predefined set of rules and make it easy for administrators to add those rule sets. So there we added the remote desktop rule. And then lastly, let's look at the custom rule. So the custom rule is going to give us a lot more options. We're going to choose all programs. Let's come down here to the protocol type. So we've talked about TCP and UDP, but there's lots of different types of protocols. There's one we haven't talked about called ICMP. This is what the ping protocol uses. So when I ping another computer, that doesn't use TCP or UDP, that actually uses ICMP protocol. So I'm going to select ICMP. I could even come in here and specify specifically what type of ICMP packets to allow. I'm going to allow all of them. We can specify which local IP addresses is this rule to apply to. We're going to apply it to any of them. And where do we want to allow this traffic from? For now, we're going to allow this from anywhere. We're going to look at this in further detail in a second. We're going to allow the connection. All of our profiles again. Give it a name. I'm just going to call it ICMP. But let's put ping in quotation marks there because that's the most common use of ICMP traffic. Finish that, and there we have our ICMP rule. So let's look at this remote desktop rule. Let's go into the properties on it, and we can further define this rule. So it's on the system program. That's what RDP runs under. We can say which computers it's authorized from. This would only be used in a domain type environment. We can say which users are allowed to use this. Again, most likely in a domain type environment. Here we specify which profiles it applies to. But here's the one I really want to get to is the scope. So here, as we looked at earlier, we can define where the traffic is going to be allowed from, which remote IP addresses this rule applies to. By default, it applies to any IP addresses. That may be an appropriate rule for, say, a web server with HTTP traffic. But for RDP, maybe we only want to allow it from the local subnet. So I can say from these IP addresses, and then I can specify a network range, or I can use a predefined set of computers. So default gateway, my DNS servers. Here's an interesting one, the local subnet. So going back to our routing module, we can say computers that are on the local subnet that don't need to go through a router, they're allowed to connect to this service. We could also say there's another subnet. Let's say it's 192.168.16.0/24. We want to allow computers from that subnet to connect to this service. So we can define the scope of this rule and narrow it down to just the subnets that we need to allow it from. And click OK, and now that rule has been modified.